Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I had prepared a PowerPoint, but I thought that would probably be a little too formal. But I thought I would begin by this slide of Hannah Arendt, who is one of the great historians, student of Hitler, Nazi, and the origins of totalitarianism. And what she said is what makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you are not informed? But this is the point that's really important. If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And that really gives the context for what has been happening in the United States with Trump. He is a liar and surrounding himself with liars, but it's not that anybody believes anything he says, but they've given up believing in anything. And so there's been an attack on our institutions of knowledge. That was very, I think, well described in some of the previous sessions this morning, where they described the attack on our institutions of like education, free press, science. Underlying all this is an attack on what might be called epistemology, what it is that we know and how we ascertain that. Now, the reason this is so important, it can be brought back to the Enlightenment. It's been raised a couple of times. The Enlightenment really represented the historical break in our understandings. It developed the scientific method, again, that was talked about this morning. And the scientific method was a method for ascertaining the truth. And there's several aspects of it that have been brought out. The fact it's based on trust with verification. When we say we believe in climate change, I'm sure none of you have read through the huge literature. You wouldn't be here if you were reading the literature. But you trust. And why do you trust? Because there's been a system of data, open. Other people can verify it, so it's not that you just trust somebody. The data's been made available. There's this replication, the replicability, experimentation. It's all based on the system you might call open transparency, and the benefits of this have been enormous. If you look at what happened to standards of living for literally centuries before that, there had been no change. And the big break was the Enlightenment. With the scientific method, we began to learn how to do things better, and that led to increases in our standard of living. Very dramatic. So, in a way, you might say, isn't it curious that the very thing that has brought us to the prosperity that we have is now being attacked by Trump and by the Republican Party? And obviously, it's very disturbing to those of us who are committed to science and the advancement of progress to see this assault on our epistemological institutions, our institutions of knowledge. It has consequences for both our economy and for our democracy. In terms of our economy, the best evidence of this you can see is what happened in the 2008 crisis. The banks were very non-transparent. The banks knew that they were cheating and lying. And when the crisis occurred, they knew that they couldn't trust anybody. They couldn't trust themselves, or they knew nobody should trust them, but they also knew that they couldn't trust anybody else. So what happened? No bank would lend to any other bank, and the whole financial system froze, and our economies went into the Great Recession. So it was a consequence of the breakdown of trust. For our democracy, exactly the same thing. We talk about the rule of law, due process. Well, all these things require knowing what some version of the truth is. We want to know, did somebody commit the murder? But we also want to know, has he been treated fairly? If it's all a matter of one person's judgment versus another, we can't have any system of rule of law. We can't have any system. We can't have a democracy. So the importance of trust for the functioning of our economy and for the functioning of our democracy and our society is absolutely uh, vital. Now, uh, to me, the modern assault on trust and the scientific method might really be traced back to climate change. And I mentioned that this morning, the reason that was so important was so much money was at stake. And it was so clear what the science was saying. The science was saying that the continuation of the use of fossil fuels was going to have these very serious consequences, and that meant people like the Koch brothers, who had an economic interest in not pursuing the consequences. It was an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore said. They couldn't deny the science. They began denying the validity of the institutions, the scientific institutions themselves. So, in a way, that was what began the assault. But it fed on two other historical episodes of that. One was about a half century ago when evidence came that cigarettes were very bad for your health. And the scientific evidence was unambiguous. It was an inconvenient truth for the cigarette companies, and they began an assault on the science. They began an assault of skepticism. They said it hadn't been proven, even though with any degree of reliability it had been proven. So they had a monetary incentive to do that. And then the other episode was the attack on evolution, which many people from a religious background thought evolution was an attack on their fundamental religious belief. The reason I mention that is because that's an example where there was a contradiction between truth, epistemology, systems of beliefs, and religious beliefs and ideology. And that plays out in the current context in the debate about the beliefs in the market and the private government's ability to address the problems. Well, the title of this session is The Fragility of Truth. And what I want to argue is that actually our systems are not very robust. Our systems of truth are actually very fragile. What do I mean by that? Well, some systems are what we call dynamically stable. You perturb the system from them and they quickly get restored. But some systems are fragile, are dynamically unstable. Ecological systems tend to be often unstable. If you fish too much, the number of fish gets below a critical level and you get extinction. So that's an example of, at least if you have too big of a perturbation, the system doesn't restore itself. It goes into another situation which is not the good one that we originated in. I think what worries me is that, in a sense, the institutions of trust and science have that same kind of fragility. And it's for the reasons that I've just explained. That first, the institutions of truth have to compete with liars. And David Gross gave that point this morning. That the liars can give a sense of confidence, comfort for the now, for the short run, that people want. Whereas the scientific institutions always begin by saying, well, there's some degree of uncertainty and often uncomfortable is a uncomfortable truths. Um, so the liars can frame their message to what the people want to hear, and the other side feels constrained about by the truth, and that's an unfair competition in the short run. Hopefully, in the long run, people will understand this, but in the short run, that's what we're up against. They can give a false sense of certainty. The second is that the money is on the side, in many cases, of not the truth. So climate change illustrated that. But in the current context, one of the mechanisms by which there's been the assault on truth is the social media. And the social media companies have a vested interest in a technology which makes the truth more fragile. One of the problems is hurting behavior. False news can move very quickly. Many examples you may, the Hillary Clinton is a pedophile in the pizza story in the United States spread very, very rapidly. There are lots of examples of the spread of bad news, these false news, very rapidly. And the private companies like that because that gets more click, that gets more advertising, that gets more money. So the underlying architecture that leads to what is sometimes called mobocracy, ruled by mobs, is profit maximizing. And that means that we're not going to get a private sector solution. But it's worse than that. The private sector has an incentive to try to persuade everybody that the government can't solve the problem. That the solutions that would entail government regulation would make you worse off. So they can use their money in an unlevel way to feed on to the ideology that government doesn't work. And so they're trying to create an image that, yes, this is a problem, they'll acknowledge it, but leave it to us to fix. Well, we know they're not going to fix it. That is against their interest, unless a lot of public pressure is brought about. Now, then that leads to the next question. Actually, could we do something to stop, especially the problems created by the social media? I think the answer is unambiguously yes. There are many things that we can do, not necessarily perfect fixes, but they would make things much better. But here's the problem many of the things that we might do to correct the problem could be abused and have been abused by authoritarian regimes. So, some of the restrictions that you might impose are the kinds of things that that you could imagine being abused. But that's life in general. Anything that is good can also, almost everything is a two edged sword. And we have to create institutions that circumscribe the abuses of the things that are intended to circumscribe other abuses. We get checks and balances. That's the part of a democracy. So, to give you one example of something that has been done by some countries in Europe already, hate speech. Germany has outlawed hate speech. Now, that kind of provision can be abused. A totalitarian government could reclassify anything that they didn't like as hate speech. So we have to recognize that we are dealing with something that could be abused. But there are some things that where the probability of abuse is low and the mechanisms of checks and balances to prevent the abuses are not that difficult. Let me just give you a couple examples. So, one thing is there are ways of checking the speed with which bad ideas get propagated. There are ways of requiring some degrees of verification or at least disclosure of information. Who bought the ad? So you disclose the ad. What I want to say is that there are actually a whole set of measures, one of which is being discussed in the U.S. Congress now, that are, I don't want to say that they're perfect solutions, but they prevent some of the worst abuses that we have seen in fake news in the context of the social media. The final thing I want to just conclude is while science reminds us that we don't know things for certain, that doesn't mean that everything is of equal truth value. That is to say, we know that climate change is going to occur with a probability, you know, uh, 0.999999. We can be almost certain. And we can almost be certain that those who are the climate change deniers are wrong. So the fact that we're not 100% certain about things doesn't mean that all views have equal validity. And this is really important because that in the fog of the lack of certainty, there are many people who are trying Trump is trying to say, okay, now I've shown that the others are fake news. Uh, that discredits all knowledge. And that nihilism will lead to an undermining of our society and our democracy. And so, what we really have to work to is create institutions of trust in that we have ways of telling things that are true or almost certainly true from those that are lies and almost certainly lies. And that's really how to do that within a democratic society without opening ourselves up to the potential abuses is the critical issue before us now. So truth is fragile, but we can protect ourselves from the assault that the Trump administration is trying to have on our truth. Thank you.